You send an email. 30 seconds later, you notice the typo. Nobody else even sees it. Your manager doesn't mention it, your coworker doesn't notice it, but in your head, something switches on. Okay, how could you miss that? What is wrong with you? This is why. People don't take you seriously. Okay, the strange part isn't that the thought appears, small mistakes bother most people for a moment. The strange part is the tone. It doesn't sound like your own voice. Thinking a passing thought, it sounds rehearsed. It sounds like it has said these exact words before, many times, in a much younger body, in a much smaller room. And if you sit with that feeling long enough, a quieter question starts to surface underneath it. Whose voice is this? Really? Most people assume self criticism is simply a personality trait. Some people are hard on themselves, others aren't. It feels like a fixed setting, something you were either born with or somehow developed on your own. But psychologists who study this pattern closely have noticed something different. The voice that appears after a mistake almost never sounds neutral. It sounds like it has a specific rhythm, a specific vocabulary, sometimes even specific phrases that don't sound like something you would naturally say to a friend or to anyone else, for that matter. You would never tell a friend who spilled coffee. You always do this. You never think. Yet you might say exactly that to yourself in exactly that tone without even noticing the double standard. That inconsistency is the first clue. If this voice truly represented your own honest judgment, it would apply the same standard to everyone. Instead, it seems to reserve its harshest language only for you. And that's not how objective judgment works, that's how an old recording works. An individual's destructive inner voice most commonly originates in early childhood as infants. In the process of bonding with our parents, we absorb and take in their attitudes toward us. And these internalized antagonistic attitudes form the basis of the critical inner voice, not because parents intended harm. In most cases, they didn't, but because a child's mind is built to absorb long before. It's built to evaluate. Here's what makes this pattern so easy to miss. A child does not experience a parent's criticism the way an adult would. An adult can hear feedback, disagree with it internally, and set it aside. A child cannot. A child's brain is still developing the ability to separate what someone said about me from who I am. Okay, so when a caregiver's voice is frequently frustrated, disappointed, anxious, or harshly corrective, the child doesn't file that away as one opinion among many. The child absorbs it as fact. This isn't weakness, it's architecture. A child's connection to their parent is, neurologically speaking, a survival need as essential as food or shelter. So, when a parent is critical, a child's mind faces an impossible conflict. Reject the criticism or reject the parent. And rejecting the parent isn't an option the developing brain will allow. So instead, the child absorbs the criticism as truth. Think about what that actually means, a young child. Faced with an inconsistency between my parent loves me and my parent is angry with me right now, cannot hold both ideas at once. So the mind resolves the tension the only way it safely can. It decides the parent is right and the child is the problem. That single quiet decision made without words, often before age 6 or 7, becomes the seed of a voice that will keep speaking for decades. You can usually hear the echo most clearly in ordinary, low stakes moments, not the big failures. But the small ones, forgetting to reply to a text, getting a math problem wrong, in front of classmates. Years ago, showing up 4 minutes late to a family dinner in the moment. These are nothing. Life continues. Nobody remembers them. by the next day, except you do, some part of you replays it that night, and the internal commentary doesn't sound curious or forgiving. It sounds like it's building a case against you. Notice something else. Two, the voice rarely says, that was a mistake. It says, you always do this, or you never learn, or everyone can see it. It speaks in permanent categories, not specific moments. That's not how a rational adult evaluates a single event. That's how a frightened child overgeneralizes an entire identity from one uncomfortable interaction because a child doesn't yet have the cognitive tools to separate a single behavior from total self worth. You may also notice the voice doesn't only appear after failure, sometimes it appears right after something goes well, a promotion, a compliment, a relationship, finally feeling stable. And instead of relief, a quieter warning creeps in. Don't get comfortable. Don't get used to this. Something will go wrong. That, too, is often inherited. A household where good moments were followed by tension. So the nervous system learned to brace for disappointment, even in the middle of something good. Psychologists have studied this internalization process from several different angles, and they tend to arrive at a similar conclusion. From different directions, psychological research indicates that the inner critic often forms in early childhood, and according to attachment theory, children internalize the voices and attitudes of primary caregivers, especially in environments where affection is conditional on performance or behavior. So children may adopt a harsh inner voice as a coping mechanism to avoid punishment or withdrawal of affection. In other words, the inner critic wasn't originally your enemy. It began as a strategy, a way of predicting disapproval before it happened, so you could adjust in time and keep the relationship safe. Authoritarian parenting styles, in particular, have been linked to higher levels of self criticism in children, emphasizing obedience, discipline, and high expectations, often at the expense of emotional warmth. And over time, children learn to preempt external criticism by developing an internal voice that mirrors these standards. This is why the voice so often uses your parents' specific phrasing. Even words you consciously dislike, the voice consists of the internalization of destructive attitudes toward the child held by parents and other significant adults in the early environment, a largely unconscious imitation of one or both parents' maladaptive defenses and views about life and a defensive approach to life based on emotional pain experienced during the formative years. It's worth being precise here because this isn't about blame. When children are confronted with hurtful experiences in the family, they tend to absolve their parents or other family members from blame and take on the attitude that they themselves are bad, unlovable, or a burden as personal trauma and separation anxiety combine to turn children against themselves. Most parents were repeating patterns they inherited too, without full awareness of what they were passing on. This is where the picture becomes more complicated and more important. The voice you hear today is not simply a memory playing on repeat somewhere along the way. It stopped sounding like an outside voice and started sounding like you. That's a crucial shift. And it explains why simply telling someone, stop being so hard on yourself, rarely works. The voice feels like your own judgment because, in a sense, it has become fused with your identity. You don't just repeat the harsh things your parents said to you. Instead, you actively turn on yourself as a child in order to preserve the relationship with your parents. And even though that voice may be strongly influenced by what your parents said, that voice in your head is you. It's your own voice. That single distinction changes everything. This isn't about hating your parents or assigning blame. Retroactively, it's about recognizing that a coping strategy you built as a small child, one designed to keep you safe and loved, inside a specific household, is still running, unedited, inside an adult life where it no longer fits. The child who built that voice was trying to protect something precious. The adult carrying it today doesn't need that same protection anymore, but nobody sent the voice an update. So, what does this actually look like when it plays out day to day? It looks like rereading a text message 5 times before sending it, convinced there's some hidden way. It could be misread. It looks like accepting a compliment at work. With an automatic, it wasn't a big deal. Even when it clearly was, it looks like feeling a flash of dread before checking your phone, after making a small social misstep, bracing for judgment that almost never actually comes from the outside world anymore. Because by now, you're delivering it to yourself faster than anyone else could. The pattern isn't really about mistakes at all, it's about anticipation the nervous system learned a long time ago. That catching the error first before anyone else could felt safer than being caught off guard. So the inner critic isn't purely cruelty in its own way. It's an old, exhausted form of vigilance. Understanding that doesn't excuse the pain it causes, but it does change your relationship to it. A voice that is trying, however clumsily, to protect you is a very different thing to work with than a voice that is simply your enemy. If you've spent years wondering why a stranger's mild feedback can feel unbearable, or can or why a small mistake at work can trigger an entire evening of quiet self-punishment, this is likely why. It was never really about the typo or the mistext or the 4 minutes you were late. It was about a much younger version of you learning long before you had the words for it. That love could feel conditional, and building an internal alarm system to prevent that from ever happening again, that response wasn't a flaw in your character. It was an adaptation. A young mind did the best it could with the information it had, using the only tool available to a child, absorbing the criticism. Rather than losing the relationship, you didn't choose this voice, you inherited it in the same quiet way. Children inherit posture, accents, and habits without ever consciously deciding to. The typo was never really the problem. The voice that appears after it isn't proof of who you are. It's evidence of who was speaking to you years before you had any way to filter it, question it, or talk back. That doesn't mean the voice disappears the moment you understand where it came from. But something subtle does shift the next time it speaks sharp. Certain familiar, you may notice a small, quiet space open up between the sentence and yourself, enough space to ask gently, is this actually true? Or is this just an old voice still trying to protect a child who grew up a long time ago? Okay? You are allowed to thank that voice for what it once did for you, and you are also allowed to stop letting it write the ending of every ordinary day. If this helped you understand a part of yourself a little more clearly, the next video continues this exact thread, looking at what actually happens when you finally start talking back to that voice